All right. Good morning, brothers and sisters. This morning we're going to start out again reading the book Pagan Christianity by Frank Viola and George Barna. We're going to read chapter 6 and chapter 7 this morning. We're starting with chapter 6. It's labeled Sunday Morning Costumes Covering Up the Problem. Sunday Morning Costumes Covering Up the Problem. It says, beware of those who like to walk around in long robes. Jesus Christ in Luke chapter 20, verse 46. It says, beware lest any man spoil you through philosophy and vain deceit after the tradition of men and after the rudiments of the world and not after Christ. Paul of Tarsus in Colossians 2:8. Every Sunday morning, millions of Protestants throughout the world put on their best clothes to attend Sunday morning church. But no one seems to question why. Hundreds of thousands of pastors wear special garb that separates them from their congregants, and no one seems to care. Admittedly, the dress has become more casual in a number of churches over the past few decades. A person dressed in denim can walk into the sanctuaries of many churches today without getting dirty looks. Yet dressing up for church is still a common practice in many churches. In this chapter, we will explore the origin of dressing up for church. We will also trace the roots of the clergy's special attire. Dressing up for church. The practice of dressing up for church is a relatively recent phenomenon. It began in the late 18th century with the Industrial Revolution, and it became widespread in the mid-19th century. Before this time, dressing up for social events was known only among the very wealthy. The reason was simple. Only the well-to-do aristocrats of society could afford nice clothing. Common folks had only two sets of clothes: work clothes for laboring in the field and less tattered clothes for going into town. Dressing up for any occasion was only an option for the wealthiest of nobility. From medieval times until the 18th century, dress was a clear marker of one's social class. In places like England, poor people were actually forbidden to wear the clothing of the better people. And I'm going to add something here. Also in ancient times, like back whenever 2,000 years ago when Jesus was alive, if a man was caught wearing purple who was poor, they would place him in jail until they figured out how he got the purple clothing, because purple was so expensive. This changed with the invention of mass textile manufacturing and the development of urban society. Fine clothes became more affordable to the common people. The middle class was born, and those within it were able to emulate the envied aristocracy. For the first time, the middle class could distinguish themselves from the peasants. To demonstrate their newly improved status, they could now dress up for social events, just like the well-to-do. Some Christian groups in the late 18th and early 19th centuries resisted this cultural trend. John Wesley wrote against wearing expensive or flashy clothing. The early Methodists so resisted the idea of dressing up for church that they turned away anyone who wore expensive clothing to their meetings. The early Baptists also condemned fine clothing, teaching that it separated the rich from the poor. Despite these protests, mainstream Christians began wearing fine clothes whenever they could. The growing middle class prospered, desiring bigger homes, larger church buildings, and fancier clothing. As the Victorian enculturation of the middle class grew, fancier church buildings began to draw more influential people in society. This all came to a head when in 1843 Horace Bushnell, an influential congregational minister in Connecticut, published an essay called Taste and Fashion. In it, Bushnell argued that sophistication and refinement were attributes of God and that Christians should emulate them. Thus was born the idea of dressing up for church to honor God. Church members now worshiped in elaborately decorated buildings, sporting their formal clothes to honor God. In 1846, a Virginia Presbyterian named William Henry Foote wrote that a church-going people are a dress-loving people. This statement simply expressed the formal dress ritual that mainstream Christians had adopted when going to church. The trend was so powerful that by the 1850s, even the formal dress-resistant Methodists got absorbed by it, and they too began wearing their Sunday best to church. Accordingly, as with virtually every other accepted church practice, dressing up for church is the result of Christians being influenced by their surrounding culture. Today, many Christians suit up for Sunday morning church without ever asking why. But now you know the story behind this mindless custom. It is purely the result of 19th century middle-class efforts to become like their wealthy aristocrat contemporaries, showing their improved status by their clothing. This effort was also helped along by Victorian notions of respectability. It has nothing to do with the Bible, Jesus Christ, or the Holy Spirit. So what's wrong with it? What's the big deal about dressing up for church? It is hardly a burning issue. However, it is what dressing up for church represents that is the burning issue. First, it reflects the false division between the secular and the sacred. To think that God cares one whit if you wear dressy threads on Sunday to meet Him is a violation of the new covenant. We have access to God's presence at all times and in all circumstances. Does He really expect His people to dress up for a beauty pageant on Sunday morning? Second, wearing attractive, flashy clothes on Sunday morning screams out an embarrassing message that church is the place where Christians hide their real selves and dress them up. Let me repeat that one section. Let me repeat that. It says, second, wearing attractive, flashy clothes on Sunday morning screams out an embarrassing message that the church is the place where Christians hide their real selves and dress them up and to look nice and pretty. Think about it. Wearing your Sunday best for church is little more than image management. It gives the house of God all the elements of a stage show: costumes, makeup, props, lighting, ushers, special music, master of ceremonies, performance, and the featured program. Dressing up for church violates the reality that the church is made up of real people with messy problems. Real people who may have gotten into a major league bickering match with their spouses or one of their family members just before they drove into the parking lot and put on colossal smiles just to cover it up. Wearing our Sunday best conceals a basic underlying problem. It fosters the illusion that we are somehow good because we are dressing up for God. It is a study in pretense that is dehumanizing and constitutes a false witness to the world. Let's face it, as fallen humans, we are seldom willing to appear to be what we really are. Let's face it, as fallen humans, we are seldom willing to appear to be what we really are. We almost always rely on our performance or dress to give people a certain impression of what we want them to believe we are. All of this differs markedly from the simplicity that marked the early church. Third, dressing up for church smacks against the primitive simplicity that was the sustaining hallmark of the early church. The first century Christians did not dress up to attend church meetings. They met in the simplicity of living rooms. They did not dress to exhibit their social class. In fact, the early Christians made concrete efforts to show their absolute disdain for social class distinctions. In the church, all social and racial distinctions are erased. The early Christians knew well that they were a new species on the planet. For this reason, James levels a rebuke to those believers who were treating the rich saints better than the poor saints. He boldly reproves the rich for dressing differently from the poor. And yet many Christians are under the false delusion that it is irreverent to dress in informal clothing when attending a Sunday morning church service. This is not dissimilar to how the scribes and Pharisees accused the Lord and his disciples of being irreverent for not following the tradition of the elders. Mark 7, 1 through 13. In short, to say that the Lord expects his people to dress in fine clothing when the church gathers is to add to the scriptures and speak where God has not spoken. Such a practice is human tradition at its best. The garb of the clergy. Let's now shift gears and look at the development of the clergy attire. Christian clergy did not dress differently from the common people until the coming of Constantine. Contrary to popular opinion, clergy apparel included the ecclesiastical vestments of the high church tradition did not originate with the priestly dress of the Old Testament. It rather has its origin in the secular dress of the Greco-Roman world. Here is the story. Clement of Alexandria argued that the clergy should wear better garments than the laity. By this time, the church liturgy was regarded as a formal event. Clement said that the minister's clothes should be simple and white. White was the color of the clergy for centuries. This custom appears to have been borrowed from the pagan philosopher Plato, who wrote that white was the color of the gods. In this regard, both Clement and Tertullian felt that dyed clothes were displeasing to the Lord. With the coming of Constantine, distinctions between bishops, priests, and deacon began to take root. When Constantine moved his court to Byzantium and renamed it Constantinople in AD 330, the official Roman dress was gradually adopted by the priests and deacons. The clergy were now identified by their garb, which matched that of secular officials. After the Germanic conquest of the Roman Empire from the 4th century onward, fashions in secular dress changed. The flowing garment of the Romans gave way to the short tunics of the Goths, but the clergy, wishing to remain distinct from the laity, continued to wear the archaic Roman costumes. The clergy wore those outdated garments during the church service, following the model of the secular court ritual. When laymen adopted the new styles of dress, the clergy believed that such dress was worldly and barbarian. They retained what they considered to be civilized dress. And this is what became the clerical attire. This practice was supported by the theologians of the day. For example, Jerome, circa 342 to 420, remarked that the clergy should never enter the sanctuary wearing everyday garments. From the 5th century onward, bishops wore purple. In the 6th and 7th centuries, clergy garb became more elaborate and costly. By the Middle Ages, their clothing acquired mystical and symbolic meanings. Special vestments were spawned around the 6th and 7th centuries, and there grew up the custom of keeping a special set of garments in the vestry to put over one's street clothes. During the 7th and 8th centuries, the vestments were accepted as sacred objects, inherited from the robes of Levitical priests in the Old Testament. This was a rationalization to justify the practice. By the 12th century, the clergy also began wearing street clothes that distinguished them from everyone else. What the Reformation changed. During the Reformation, the break with tradition and clerical vestments was slow and gradual. In the place of the clergy vestments, the Reformers adopted the scholar's black gown. It was also known as the philosopher's cloak, and as it had been worn by philosophers in the 4th and 5th centuries. So prevalent was the new clerical garb that the black gown of the secular scholar became the garment of the Protestant pastor. The Lutheran pastor wore his long black gown in the streets. He also wore a round ruff around his neck that grew larger with time. It grew so large that by the 17th century the ruff was called the millstone ruff. Think about that, if you will, the millstone ruff. The ruff is still worn in some Lutheran churches today. Interestingly, however, the Reformers still retained the clerical vestments. The Protestant pastor wore them when he administered the Lord's Supper. This is still the case today in many Protestant denominations. Just like Catholic priests, many pastors will put on their clerical robes before lifting the bread and the cup. The garb of the Reformed pastor, the black gown, symbolized his spiritual authority. This trend continued throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. Pastors always wore dark clothing, preferably black. This was the traditional color for professionals such as lawyers and doctors during the 16th century. Black soon became the color of every minister in every branch of the church. The black scholar's gown eventually evolved into the frock coat of the 1940s. The frock coat was later replaced by the black or gray lounge suit of the 20th century. At the beginning of the 20th century, many clergymen wore white collars with a tie. In fact, it was considered highly improper for a clergyman to appear without a tie. Low church clergy, Baptists, Pentecostals, etc., wore the collar and necktie. High church clergy, Anglicans, Episcopalians, Lutherans, etc., adopted the clerical collar, often dubbed the dog collar. The origin of the clerical collar goes back to 1865. It was not a Catholic invention, as is popularly believed. It was invented by the Anglicans. Priests in the 18th and 19th century traditionally wore black cassocks, floor-length garments with collars that stood straight up, over white garments, sometimes called the alb. In other words, they wore a black collar with white in the middle. The clerical collar was simply a removable version of this collar. It was invented so that the priests Both Anglican and Catholic could slip it over their street clothes and be recognized as men of God. They could slip it over their street clothes and be recognized as men of God in any place. Today, it is the dark suit with the tie that is the standard attire of most Protestant pastors. Many pastors would not be caught dead without it. Some Protestant pastors wear the clergy collar as well. The collar is the unmistakable symbol that the person wearing it is a clergyman. Is special clergy attire harmful? A special attired clergy is an affront to the spiritual principles that govern the house of God. It strikes at the heart of the church by separating God's people into two classes: professional and non-professional. Like dressing up for church, the clerical clothing, whether it be the elaborate vestments of the high church ministers or the dark suit of the evangelical pastor, it is rooted in worldly culture. The distinctive garb of the clergy goes back to the 4th century, when clergymen adopted the dress of Roman secular officials. The Lord Jesus and his disciples knew nothing of wearing special clothing to impress God or to distinguish themselves from God's people. Wearing special garb for religious purposes was rather a characteristic of the scribes and Pharisees. And neither scribe nor Pharisee could escape the Lord's penetrating gaze when he said, "Beware of the teachers of the law. They like to walk around in flowing robes and love to be greeted in the marketplaces and have the most important seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at banquets." Luke 20:46. Delving deeper. Number 1, you imply that people should never be encouraged to dress up for church. However, for me, doing so serves as a reminder that we should give God the respect he deserves. In this sense, isn't wearing good clothes to church a positive thing? If you feel that dressing up for church gatherings is a positive thing and you can do it unto the Lord with pure motives, then by all means do so. But we should be careful not to judge or look down upon those who do not dress up for such gatherings. Number 2, do you believe that dressing up for church is inherently wrong, or do you think it is a human-invented practice that can be redeemed? The latter. Unlike some of the other traditional practices that we have traced in this book, we believe this one is an extra-biblical practice that can be redeemed. See answer above. There is nothing inherently wrong with wearing dressy clothes to a Christian gathering. As with all our religious traditions, we simply believe it is important to ask why we do it and get in touch with our motives behind it. All right, moving on to chapter 7. Ministers of music, clergy set to music. The hallmark of an authentic evangelism is not the uncritical repetition of old traditions, but the willingness to submit every tradition, however ancient, to fresh biblical scrutiny, and if necessary, reform. John Stott, 20th century British minister and Bible scholar. The real trouble is not, in fact, that the church is too rich, but that it has become heavily institutionalized, with a crushing investment in maintenance. It has the characteristics of the dinosaur in Battleship. It is saddled with a plant and program beyond its means, so that it is absorbed in problems of supply and preoccupied with survival. The inertia of the machine is such that the financial allocations, the legalities, the channels of organization, the attitudes of mind are all set in the direction of continuing and enhancing the status quo. If one wants to pursue a course which cuts through these channels, then most of one's energies are exhausted before one ever reaches the enemy lines. John A.T. Robinson, 20th century English New Testament scholar. Walk into any church service, Christian church service, and you'll find it will usually begin with the singing of hymns, choruses, or praise and worship songs. One person or a team of people will both lead and direct the singing. In more traditional churches, it will be the choir director or the music minister. In some churches, this role is even played by the senior pastor, or it may be handled by the choir itself. In contemporary churches, it will be the worship leader or the praise and worship team. Leading up to the sermon, those who lead worship select the songs that are to be sung. They begin those songs, they decide how those songs are to be sung, and they decide when those songs are over. Those sitting in the audience in no way, shape, or form lead the singing. They are led by someone else who is often part of the clerical staff, or who has similar stature. This is in stark contrast to the New Testament teaching. An example: in the early church, worship and singing were in the hands of all of God's people. The church herself led her own songs. Singing and leading songs was a corporate affair, not a professional event led by specialists. The origins of the choir. This all began to change with the rise of the clergy and the advent of the Christian choir, which dates back to the 4th century. Shortly after the Edict of Milan, AD 313, or the Edict of Tolerance, the persecution of Christians ceased. The Edict of Tolerance. The persecution of Christians ceased. During Constantine's reign, choirs were developed and trained to help celebrate the Eucharist. The practice was borrowed from Roman custom, which began its imperial ceremonies with processional music. Special schools were established, and choir singers were given the status of a second-string clergy. The roots of the choir are found in the pagan Greek temples and Greek dramas. Will Durant states it beautifully. In the Middle Ages, as in ancient Greece, the main fountainhead of drama was in religious liturgy. The Mass itself was a dramatic spectacle, the sanctuary a sacred stage. The celebrants wore symbolic costumes. Priests and acolytes engaged in dialogue, and the antiphonal responses of priests and choir, and of choir to choir, suggested precisely the same evolution of drama from dialogue that had generated the sacred Dionysian play. With the advent of the choir in the Christian church, singing was no longer done by all of God's people, but by clerical staff composed of trained singers. This shift was particularly due to the fact that heretical doctrines were spread through hymn singing. The clergy felt that if the singing of hymns was in their control, it would curb the spread of heresy. But it was also rooted in the ever-growing power of the clergy as the main performers in the Christian drama. By AD 367, congregational singing was altogether banned. It was replaced by music from the trained choirs. Thus was born the trained professional singer in the church. Singing in Christian worship was now the domain of the clergy and choir. Ambrose is credited for creating the first post-apostolic Christian hymns. These hymns were modeled on the old Greek modes and called by Greek names. Ambrose also created a collection of liturgical chants that are still used today in some Catholic churches. The liturgical chant is a direct descendant of the pagan Roman chant, which goes back to the ancient Sumerian cities. Papal choirs began in the 5th century. When Gregory the Great became pope near the end of the 6th century, he reorganized the Schola Cantorum, or the school of singing, in Rome. This school was founded by Pope Sylvester, who died in AD 335. With this school, Gregory established professional singers who trained Christian choirs all throughout the Roman Empire. The singers trained for 9 years. They had to memorize every song that they sang, including the famous Gregorian chant. Gregory wiped out the last vestiges of congregational singing, believing music was a clerical function and the exclusive right of trained singers. Trained choirs, trained singers, and the end of congregational singing all reflected the cultural mindset of the Greeks. Much like oratory, professional speaking, the Greek culture was built around an audience-performer dynamic. Typically, this trait was carried over from the temples of Diana and the Greek dramas straight into the Christian church. The congregation of God's people became spectators not only in spoken ministry, but in singing as well. Regrettably, the spirit of Greek spectatorship still lives in the contemporary church. Christian boys' choirs also go back to the days of Constantine. Some still exist. Most were created from orphanages. The Vienna Boys' Choir, for example, was founded in Vienna, Austria in 1498. And I'll add something here that most people may not know. These boys in the Vienna Boys' Choir were all castrated so that they maintained their high-pitched singing voice throughout their younger age. Throughout up until they're older. Think about that for a bit. It says, the Vienna Boys' Choir, for example, was founded in Vienna, Austria in 1498. The choir sang exclusively for the court at Mass and at private concerts and state events. The first boys' choirs were actually established by pagans who worshipped Greco-Roman gods. These pagans believed that the voice of young boys possessed spiritual or special powers. Hence the reason that they castrated them, to maintain their young boy voice. The funeral dirge and procession. Another form of music with pagan roots is the funeral dirge. It was brought into the Christian church in the early 3rd century. As one scholar put it, the pagan culture of the pagan cult of the dead was too much a part of the past lives of many Christians, formerly pagans, for them simply to be able to replace pagan dirges and funeral music with psalmody. During the days of Constantine, Roman betrothal practices and funeral processions were adapted and transformed into Christian funerals. This was borrowed from pagan practice. The so-called funeral dirge that is observed and accepted by Christians also came out of paganism. It was brought into the Christian church in the early 3rd century. Tertullian was opposed to Christian funeral procession simply because it had pagan origins. Not only did the funeral procession emerge out of paganism, so did the funeral oration. It was the common practice of pagans in the Roman Empire to hire one of the town's eloquent professors to speak at the funeral of a loved one. The speaker followed a little handbook for such occasions. He would work himself up to a passionate pitch and then say of the deceased, "He now lives among the gods, traversing the heavens and looking down on life below." It was his job to comfort the loved ones of the deceased. This role is filled today by the contemporary pastor. Even the words of the oration are strikingly similar. The contribution of the Reformers. The major musical contribution of the Reformers was the restoration of congregational singing and the use of instruments. John Huss, 1372 to 1415, of Bohemia, and his followers, called Hussites, were among the first to bring back both into the church. Luther also encouraged congregational singing during certain parts of the service. But congregational hymn singing did not reach its peak until the 18th century during the Wesleyan revival in England. In Reformation churches, the choir remained. It both supported and led congregational singing. About 150 years after the Reformation, congregational singing became a generally accepted practice. By the 18th and 18th centuries, the organ would take the place of the choir in leading Christian worship. Interestingly, there is no evidence of musical instruments in the Christian church service until the Middle Ages. Before then, all singing during the service was unaccompanied by musical instruments. The church fathers took a dim view of musical instruments, associating them with immorality and idolatry. Calvin agreed, viewing musical instruments as pagan. Consequently, for 2 centuries, Reformed churches sang psalms without the use of instruments. The organ was the first instrument used by post-Constantinian Christians. Organs were found in Christian churches as early as the 6th century, but they were not used during the Mass until the 12th century. By the 13th century, the organ became an integral part of the Mass. The organ was first used to give the tone to the priest and the choir. During the Reformation, the organ became the standard instrument used in Protestant worship, except among the Calvinists, who removed and demolished church organs. The first organ to be purchased by an American church was in 1704. The first Protestant choirs began flourishing in the mid-18th century. Special seats were assigned to the choir members to show their special status. At first, the function of the choir was to set the pitch for the congregational singing. But before long, the choir began to contribute special selections. Thus was born special music by the choir as the congregation watched it perform. By the end of the 19th century, the children's choir made its appearance in American churches. By this time, it became customary for the choir in non-liturgical churches to play special music. This practice was eventually carried over to liturgical churches as well. The location of the choir is worth noting. In the late 16th century, the choir moved from the chancel or clergy platform to the rear gallery where the pipe organ was installed. But during the Oxford movement in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the choir returned to the chancel. It was at this time that the choir members began wearing ecclesiastical robes. By the 1920s and 30s, it was customary for American choirs to wear these special vestments to match the newly acquired neo-Gothic church buildings. The choir in their archaic clerical clothes were now standing with the clergy in front of the people. The origin of the worship team. In many contemporary churches, whether charismatic or non-charismatic, the choir has been replaced by the worship team. Such churches have sanctuaries that boast few religious symbols, except possibly banners or flags. At the front of the stage is a simple podium, some plants, amplifiers, speakers, and lots of wires. The dress is usually casual. Folding chairs or theater seats typically are used in place of pews. The standard worship team includes an amplified guitar, drums, keyboard, possibly a bass guitar, and some special vocalists. Words are usually projected onto a screen or a bare wall by an overhead or video projector or by PowerPoint slides. The songs are typically selected before the worship service. They are rarely songbook songbook or hymnals. There are rarely songbooks or hymnals. In such churches, worship means following the band's prescribed songs. The praise and worship time typically lasts 20 to 40 minutes. The first songs are usually upbeat praise choruses. The worship team will then lead a lively hand clapping, body swaying, hand raised, sometimes dancing congregation into a potpourri of individualistic, gentle, worshipful songs. Typically, the focus of the song is on individual spiritual experience. First person singular pronouns, I, me, my, dominate a good number of the songs. In some contemporary churches, the trend is moving more toward corporate first person plural lines, like we, us, or our. This is a wonderful shift. As the band leaves the stage, ushers pass the offering plates. This is usually followed by the sermon, and the pastor dominates the rest of the service. In many churches, the pastor will call the worship team to return to the stage to play a few more worshipful songs as he winds up his sermon. Ministry time may ensue as the band plays on. The song liturgy just described works like clockwork in the typical charismatic and non-denominational church. But where did it come from? In 1962, a group of dissatisfied British church musicians in Dublin, Scotland, tried to revitalize traditional Christian songs. Led by congregational minister Eric Routley, these artists were influenced by Bob Dylan and Sidney Carter. George Shorney Jr. of Hope Publishing Company brought their new style into the United States. These new Christian hymns were a reform, but not a revolution. The revolution came when rock and roll was adapted into Christian music with the coming of the Jesus movement. This reform set the stage for the revolutionary musical changes to take root in the Christian church through Calvary Chapel and the Vineyard. The origin of the worship team goes back to the founding of Calvary Chapel in 1965. Chuck Smith, the founder of the denomination, started a ministry for hippies and surfers. Smith welcomed the newly converted hippies to retune their guitars and play their now redeemed music in church. He gave the counterculture a stage for their music, allowing them to play Sunday night performances and concerts. The new musical forms began to be called praise and worship. As the Jesus movement began to flourish, Smith founded the record company Maranatha Music in the early 1970s. Its goal was to distribute the songs of these young artists. The Vineyard, under the influence of music genius John Wimber, followed suit with the worship team. Wimber, a former Calvary Chapel pastor, became head of the Vineyard movement in 1982. Since that time, the Vineyard was probably had more influence on establishing worship teams and worship music than Calvary Chapel. Vineyard music was regarded as more intimate and worshipful, while Calvary Chapel's music is known for its upbeat, praise-oriented songs. In due time, the guitar replaced the organ as the central instrument that led worship in the Protestant church. Although patterned after the rock concert of secular culture, the worship team has become as common as the pulpit. So what's the gripe? Perhaps you are wondering, what's wrong with having a choir leader, a worship leader, or a worship team to lead church singings? Nothing, if every member of the church is content with it. However, many Christians feel that it robs God's people of a vital function to select and lead their own singing in a meeting, to have divine worship in their own hands, to allow Jesus Christ to direct the singing of His church rather than to have it led by a human facilitator. Singing in the early church was marked by these very features. Listen to Paul's description of a New Testament church meeting. Every one of you hath a psalm. 1 Corinthians 14:26. Speak to one another with psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. Ephesians 5:19. Consider the words, every one of you. Song leaders, choir, and worship teams make this impossible by limiting the headship of Christ, specifically his ministry of leading his brethren into singing praise songs to his Father. Of this ministry, which is little known today, the writer of Hebrews says, both the one who makes men holy and those who are made holy are of the same family. So Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers. He says, I will declare your name to be my brothers in the presence of the congregation or ecclesia. I will sing your praises. Hebrews 2:11-12. When worship songs can only be announced, initiated, and led by the talented, this element of the service becomes more like entertainment than corporate worship. And only those who make the cut are allowed to participate in the ministry of leading songs. We would argue that according to the New Testament principle, the ministry of singing belongs in the hands of all of God's people, and there should be an outlet for this ministry to be expressed. I, Frank, am no theoretician. For almost 20 years I have gathered with churches where every member has been trained to start a song spontaneously. Imagine every brother and sister free to lead songs under the headship of Christ Jesus, even to write his or her own songs and bring them to the meeting for all to learn. I have met with numerous churches that have experienced this glorious dynamic. Someone starts a song and everyone joins in. Then someone else begins another song, and so worship continues without long pauses and with no visible leader present. This is exactly how the first century Christians worshiped. By the way, this is exactly how the first century Christians worshiped, by the way. Yet it is a rare experience in the modern day institutional church. The good news is that it is possible and available for all who wish to experience Christ's headship through song in a church meeting. The singing in such churches is intensely corporate rather than individualistic and subjective. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept, when we remembered Zion. We hanged our harps upon the willows in the midst thereof. For there they that carried us away captive required of us a song, and they that wasted us required of us mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? When the Lord turned again the captivity of Zion, we were like them that dream. Then was our mouth filled with laughter and our tongue with singing. Then said they among the heathen, the Lord hath done great things for them. Psalms 137, 1-4, and 126, 1 and 2. Delving deeper. Number 1, you expose the pagan roots of the church choir. Yet I don't see why that in and of itself makes it less valuable. I don't have the gift of singing, but appreciate those who love music and are gifted in that area that take the time and effort to prepare to lead me into worship through song. Your thoughts? We also appreciate those who are musically gifted and who can use their musical talents to bless others. However, to regulate the song selections in every gathering to a select few, i.e. the choir or worship team, disallows the rest of the body from participating in the ministry. This contradicts Scripture, as Paul says, every one of you hath a psalm in the gathering. 1 Corinthians 14:26. See also Ephesians 5:19 and Colossians 3:16. Number 2, currently my pastor and the worship team leader Choose music that corresponds with the morning's message. I may not connect with every song chosen, but I don't see how that would be any different if everyone present were invited to choose and lead a song. If someone has never seen a group of Christians choosing and leading their own song spontaneously under Christ's headship, it is difficult to grasp what this would look like. Suffice it to say that there is a world of difference between having a select group of people pick the songs and having every believer participate in initiating songs. It is the difference between passively following one person or a small group and everyone actively participating together spontaneously as a group. Number 3. In the Old Testament period, I see Chronicles 23:5 and 30, 25:1 through 31, and 2 Chronicles 7:6. God instituted professional worship leaders among the Levitical families who led public worship and wrote many of the Psalms, e.g. those by Asaph and the descendants of Korah. Do you think this provides a biblical basis for a valid music ministry? Why or why not? We believe these passages actually support our point. The Old Testament priesthood was restricted to a select group of people, the Levites. In the New Covenant, that selective priesthood has been done away with, and every Christian has been made a priest unto God. We are not part of the Levitical priesthood. We are priests after the order of Melchizedek. Hebrews 5 through 7. Christ is our high priest, and every believer is a priest under him. 1 Peter 2, 5 and 9. Revelation 1 and 6. Therefore, to our minds, those passages show that every Christian has the right to participate in leading worship under Christ's headship. Number 4. Do you feel it is wrong for a Christian to sing a solo in a church gathering, or for a band to play a song and lead a group of believers into worshipful singing? Not at all. We are simply arguing that if these things eclipse or make void completely replace the ministry given to every believer to lead and participate in singing and praise and worship songs to the Lord, we should consider the possibility that we may have squelched a God-ordained ministry of the church. All right, and that's the end of chapter 7. Next time we'll come back, and I believe I'll be reading chapters 8 and chapters 9 next time. I love you all, brothers and sisters. You have a blessed, wonderful day. Stay strong in the Lord. Jesus loves you.